My name is Crystal Thorne, and I was 33. The weekend my mother-in-law put my son on a grown man's bed and threw his crib in the trash. My husband was deployed. I was at drill 2 hours out of cell range, doing the thing the Army pays me to do. When I drove back onto our street, the first thing I saw was our gray trash bin at the curb and 4 white slats sticking up out of it like ribs. My mother-in-law stood in the doorway with paint on her hands and a smile on her face, and she said the words I will never forget. What she didn't plan for, what none of them planned for, was who would knock on that door 3 hours later, and what the officer would call me 1 hour after that. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people meet impossible families and answer with quiet steel instead of screaming. If a story ever made you sit up a little straighter in your own kitchen, your home here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe so the next one finds you. Let me back up to the version of me that still thought careful was enough. I joined the Army at 18 because the alternative was a trailer in a town that was already forgetting my name. 11 years later, I had stripes on my sleeve, a clean record, and a baby boy named Noah, who was 10 weeks old and smelled like milk and laundry soap. Daniel, my husband, was 3 months into a deployment overseas, so most nights it was just me and Noah, and the kind of tired that comes from doing everything right and still bracing for the day it isn't enough. My own mother had passed too, years before. The last thing she ever made with her hands was a knit blanket, the color of wheat, and I kept it draped over the side of Noah's crib, so a little of her would always be near him. People who don't live this life think single parenting and uniform is about toughness. It isn't. It's about lists. I had a list for feedings, a list for the sitter, a list taped inside the kitchen cabinet for anyone who might ever need to step in. I trusted paper more than I trusted promises, because paper doesn't change its story when it's inconvenient. That weekend, I had a plan for every hour of drill. I knew who would Noah when he ate, where his pediatrician was, what to do if the power went out. I had thought about everything. I had a plan for every hour of that weekend. What I did not have was a plan for Linda. Linda was Daniel's mother, and she had decided to dislike me before I ever said a word. At our wedding, she told a cousin I looked sturdy, like that was the kindest thing she could manage. She had a line she repeated whenever the subject of Noah came up, soft as a hymn and sharp as a tack. A baby needs roots, not a duffel bag. I used to think it was just snobbery. It wasn't, and I'm not going to pretend it was, because truth is sadder. Daniel's father had been Army too, gone more years than he was home, and one day he was gone for good. Linda raised Daniel alone in a house that smelled like resentment and burnt coffee. So when she looked at me, she didn't see her son's wife. She saw the uniform that had taken her husband, walking around with her grandson on its hip. I understood that. I did. But understanding why a person is cruel is not the same as agreeing to be the place they put it. The week of that drill, Linda called Daniel's sister, and the two of them decided I needed support. Linda texted me all warmth and exclamation points that she'd love to come stay a few days and meet the baby properly. I should have felt grateful. Instead, the back of my neck went cold, the way it does on a range when something's about to go wrong and you can't see it yet. I told her the schedule was already covered. She told me family always finds a way. I didn't sleep well that night, and I couldn't have told you exactly why. Here is something most civilians don't know. If you're a soldier with a child and no spouse on hand, you are required to have a family care plan on file. Not suggested, required. It names exactly who cares for your kid when duty pulls you away, and that person has to be vetted and approved, in writing signed. My plan named Dana, the wife of a Guyan. My unit, a woman I trusted with my life and had babysat through 3 deployments. Dana had a key, my pediatrician's number, and the same list everyone got. Linda was not on that plan. Linda had never been on that plan, because a plan is a promise you can't take back when you're mad, and I did not trust her promises. I'd also enrolled us in the new parent support program, which sends a nurse to your home to check on the baby and the new parent. Free, voluntary, gentle. My nurse was a woman named Ms. Calloway, and she had a visit scheduled for that very Saturday afternoon. I had the binder for all of it on the kitchen counter, tabbed and dated. And yes, my unit teased me about it. 11 years in, I trust paper more than promises. The Friday before drill, Linda texted again. I'll just pop by to see the baby. 3 dots, then a heart. My stomach turned over. I texted Dana right away, plain as I could make it. Do not leave him with anyone but me. Dana sent back a thumbs up. I locked my phone, told myself I was being dramatic, and went to pack my ruck. I was being a lot of things that weekend. Dramatic wasn't one of them. Saturday morning came gray and early. The reserve center was about 40 minutes out past the feed store and the long, flat stretch where the radio loses every station but one. Drill weekends are not optional, and they're not flexible. We had a field exercise on the schedule, which meant phones locked in a metal cabinet for 2 hours. No exceptions, no. Signal any way out where they'd put us. I knew all of that going in. I'd planned around it. Before I left, I stood in the nursery with Noah on my shoulder, swaying the way you do without deciding. 2. The room was small and plain, and his crib against the wall, the wheat-colored blanket folded over the rail, the little lamp that hummed. I pressed my face into the warm spot behind his ear and breathed him in. Milk, and that blanket, and the particular sweetness of a baby who has no idea the world is anything but safe. Dana arrived at 8 on the dot. I went over the list out loud, even though she knew it cold. I told myself the hard part was leaving him. I kissed his forehead, handed him over, and walked to my truck while my chest did the thing it always did, that tight pull like a seatbelt across the heart. I told myself the hard part was leaving. I was wrong about which part of that day was going to be hard. At the reserve center, I locked my phone in the cabinet with the others at 9:30. The lid clicked shut. For 2 hours, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I'd promised. And for 2 hours, I had no idea. I pieced the next part together later, from Dana and from people who were honest enough to tell me what they saw. Around 10 that morning, a car pulled into my driveway. Linda and Daniel's sister, Brenda, who lived 20 minutes away and had appointed herself the responsible one in a family that confused control with love. They knocked, and when Dana opened the door with Noah on her hip, Linda walked in like she owned the deed. "We're family," she said. "We've got him now." Dana said no. She said it twice, polite the first time, firm the second, and she pulled out her phone to call me, which is exactly what I would have wanted, but there was no answer because my phone was in a metal cabinet 40 minutes away. Brenda stepped between Dana and the nursery and said the thing this family always says when it wants to do harm, and call it love. Family handles family. Dana told me she stood her ground as long as she could, but she was a guest in someone else's house, outnumbered, with no signal and no idea when I'd surface. And Linda kept up that pleasant, immovable pressure that women of a certain kind have perfected over decades. Eventually, Dana left because the only other option was a screaming match in front of a 10-week-old, and she texted me the second she got bars at the end of the street. Her last words to me later were the ones that still sit in my chest. As she backed out of the driveway, she looked up at the house, and through the front window, she saw Linda already dragging something heavy toward the door. What Linda did next, she did, believing she was saving her grandson. That's the part people find hard to hear. She didn't think of herself as a villain. She thought of herself as a rescuer, and that made her dangerous in a way plain meanness never is. She walked into Noah's nursery, looked around, and decided it offended her. Too bare, too military. She said it later to anyone who'd listened at the room. Looked like a barracks. So she opened a can of primer she'd brought in the trunk, because of course she brought paint, and she started rolling gray over my son's walls with him napping one room away. The smell of fresh primer filled the house. That sharp chemical sweetness that gets into the back of your throat and stays. Brenda called it decluttering. Linda called it civilizing. By noon, a neighbor named Pat May had drifted over, a friend of Linda's from church who liked nothing better than a project with someone else's family at the center of it. Pat brought her phone out and filmed a little narrating in a low, pious voice about poor Daniel and that baby and that mother who was never home. Linda stood in the middle of the wet paint and the mess she was making and declared to the room and to the camera, "No grandchild of mine sleeps in a supply closet." And then she turned to look at the crib against the wall, the one I'd built on my knees at midnight, the one with my dead mother's blanket folded over the rail. I wish I could tell you she stopped there. She was just getting started. She moved Noah out of his crib and laid him down on the guest bed instead. The big soft adult bed propped between two pillows in a room that reeked of primer, with the door shut and a space heater ticking away 3 feet from his face. Every single thing about that is what a nurse would call an unsafe sleep environment, and what I would call the longest 2 hours of my life that I didn't even know were happening. Then she and Brenda carried the crib out the front door, down the walk, and shoved it into the gray trash bin at the curb. The white slats wouldn't fit all the way, so they stuck up out of the top. They threw the safe sleep gear in after it, and they threw the wheat-colored blanket my mother knit in, too. The last thing her hands ever made, balled up and tossed on top of the pile like garbage. But filmed. Brenda laughed, and Linda, wiping primer off her palms with a rag, looked at the mess of my son's hole. Little World jammed into a trash can and said the words, "The ones I'd hear," repeated back to me by a caseworker. Before the day was out, "No army brat will ruin my son's house." She was still smiling when the knock came at the door. None of them were expecting anyone, but it was 1:30 on a Saturday and a visit had been on my calendar for 2 weeks. The woman at the door was Miss Calloway, my new parent support nurse arriving for the home visit I'd scheduled and forgotten to cancel because there was nothing to cancel. She was a calm, broad woman in her 50s who had seen everything once and most things twice. She didn't need to come inside to start adding it up. There was a crib in the trash bin at the curb with the slats poking out. There was the smell of paint rolling out. The open door. There was a strange woman with primer on her hands telling her, "There's no soldier here today. You can go." Calloway asked where the baby was. Linda said he was sleeping and it wasn't her concern. Calloway is a mandated reporter, which means the law does not give her the option of pretending she didn't see what she saw. She told Linda evenly that she had an obligation to report the conditions in front of her. Then she walked back to her car and she made the call that started everything. "I want to stop here and tell you something, because I learned it the hard way that day. Do the boring, careful things even when nobody claps. Keep the plan. Keep the paperwork. If you've ever been the one who overprepares while people roll their eyes and call you dramatic, this story is for you." Comment I'd have called too, and let's keep going because I was still standing in a field. Phone locked away with no idea the wheels were already turning. At 11:30, they unlocked the cabinet and handed our phones back. Mine lit up the second it powered on and kept lighting up. Texts from Dana stacked one on top of the other, each one worse than the last. They made me leave. "Crystal, I'm so sorry. I tried." And then a photo snapped fast through a windshield, blurry but unmistakable. My trash bin at the curb and 4 white slats reaching up out of it. I have been trained to keep my hands steady when everything in me wants to shake. That training is the only reason I didn't drop the phone. My stomach went straight through the floor, but my hands stayed flat and still, and some cold, quiet part of my brain started doing what it does best, which is making a list. Panic is a luxury. I filed it away for later. I walked, did not run to my first sergeant, and I held up the phone so he could see the photo. I told him in plain words what I was looking at. He's a man who's watched a lot of soldiers go through a lot of bad days, and his face did something I'd never seen it do. It went to stone. He looked at the picture, then at me, and he didn't ask a single question I'd have to answer twice. Thorn, go. He was already reaching for his own phone. "I'll make the calls." I didn't know yet what calls he meant. I just knew I had 40 minutes of road between me and my son, and I drove every one of them like the speed limit was a personal insult. Here's the machine I didn't fully understand was already running when a report of an unsafe child comes in, and that child belongs to a military family. The civilian side and the military side don't work in separate rooms. They talk. Child Protective Services makes contact with the installation's family advocacy program. Family advocacy notifies the soldier's commander and law enforcement and the medical side, and they move as a team because a child's safety is not a thing anybody is allowed to sit on. I knew all of this the way you know the rules of a game you've never had to play. I did not know yet that Calloway had already filed. I only knew I had to get home. On the long flat stretch where the radio dies, I called Dana on speaker and made her walk me through it minute by minute. What time Linda came, what she said when Dana left, what she saw out the window. I wasn't venting. I was building a timeline the same way I'd build one for an after-action report, because somewhere in the back of my training, my brain had already decided this was going to come down to who could tell the truth in order with dates. Dana kept apologizing. I kept telling her she did exactly right because she protested. She called me. She tried. The failure wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. It belonged to a woman who walked into my house and decided love meant getting her own way. I came off the flat stretch, and the radio crackled back to life.
And
I had the strange, sick feeling that somewhere ahead of me, doors were already opening that I hadn't knocked on yet. I pulled onto our street at 12, and there it was, exactly like Dana's photo, exactly like the picture that's been burning behind my eyes ever since. Our gray trash bin at the curb for white slats reaching up out of it. I didn't stop to look. I left the truck half in the driveway and went through my own front door, and the smell hit me before anything else did. Primer thick enough to taste. Every window shut tight against the cold. I found my son on the guest bed between two pillows near a space heater in a room you could not breathe in. I had him up and against my chest in under a second. I carried him straight to the living room, through the windows open one-handed, killed the heater, and stood there in the cold, clean air, feeling his little breath against my neck while my heart finally caught up with my body. Linda came out of the hallway with primer still on her hands and looked at me like I was the intruder. Well, she said, finally, decided to act like a mother. I did not raise my voice. I have learned that the quietest thing in the room is usually the one people remember. Step back from him, I said. Now, she stepped back. I think the flatness of it surprised her more than yelling would have. And then, on my way past the front door with Noah safe against me, I looked into that trash bin one more time, and I saw it. A corner of wheat-colored wool balled up under the slats, my mother's blanket in the garbage. That was the moment the cold quiet in me turned into something with a spine. The first thing I did was not yell at Linda, which I'm proud of, and not call a lawyer, which came later. The first thing I did was put Noah in his car seat and drive him to the clinic, because the only opinion in that house I cared about was a doctor's. They checked him head to toe. He was fine, pink, fussy, hungry, perfect. No harm done, which is a sentence I have thanked God for more times than I can count, because it could so easily have gone another way, and I know it. While they weighed him, I stood in the corner of the exam room and started writing times, names, what Dana saw, what I walked into. I saved her photo 3 places so it couldn't disappear. It Wasn't strategy, it was instinct, the same instinct that keeps us soldiers. Gear squared away when everything else is chaos. By the time we got home, Linda and Brenda had cleaned up the worst of the visible mess, as if a mopped floor could unring the bell. My phone buzzed. Brenda, you left. Everyone saw the kind of message that told me they thought this was a fight about appearances, about who looked like the better mother. On a Saturday afternoon, then I saw Pat had posted her little video to a neighborhood page, all sighs and head shakes about that poor deployed boy and his absent wife. The comments were already stacking up. I read 3 of them and put the phone face down. Everyone saw it. Brenda said, I sat on the floor of my son's stripped paint, stinking nursery, and thought very calmly, you have no idea what everyone is about to see. That night, after Noah was fed and finally down in a borrowed bassinet, a neighbor dropped off, I sat at the kitchen table with my binder and turned on every light in the house. I needed to see it all in order in ink, dated, signed, the family care plan with Dana's name on it and the approval stamp, and Linda's name nowhere, the new parent, support enrollment paperwork, the pediatrician's records current, the schedule, the list taped inside the cabinet, years of being told I was too careful, too rigid, that I treated raising a baby like a deployment. And that night, every careful thing I'd ever done lined up like sandbags against a flood. I had spent a long time being embarrassed about the binder. Sitting there, careful felt like a life raft. People think preparation is fear. It isn't. It's the opposite. It's deciding ahead of time that you will not be at anyone's mercy. I went through the tabs, one by one, and I found a page I'd half forgotten, an email I'd glanced at on my phone hours earlier without really reading. Calloway's office had sent me a copy of something at 1:48 that afternoon. While I was at the clinic with Noah, I opened it on my laptop. It was the report, not a warning, not a heads up. The actual filed report of what she'd observed at my address that day, with a timestamp and a case number and language I'd seen on the working end of my own job. I sat very still and read it twice. And right there under my mother's recipe magnets and the hum of the refrigerator, I understood that the wheels weren't about to start turning. They'd been turning since 148. They were already pointed somewhere. I just hadn't read far enough to see where. I made myself read the last paragraph. Slowly, the way you read a map before you move. It said that because the child belonged to an active duty family, the matter had been referred to the Installation Family Advocacy Program, and that family advocacy would, per standard procedure, notify the service members. Commander, I read that line 4 times. The service member's commander, that was my commander, not Daniel's. He was the deployed spouse half a world away. Mine, the machine I'd always pictured as a cold, gray thing that happened to other people, was running right now on a track that led from my trash bin straight back to a captain who knew my name and had signed my last evaluation. And here is the part one want you to hold on to, because I held on to it for the rest of that long night and all the next day. That machine was not coming to take my son. It was coming because a nurse did her job and a first sergeant made his calls. And somewhere in a file was 11 years of me doing the boring, careful, documented things. The system. Linda thought she could sick on the army. Brat was a system I lived inside the right way. On the record, I sat there, with the laptop glowing, and I caught myself almost smiling, the dry, tired smile of a person who's been underestimated one too many times. Linda's words came back to me. No army. Brat will ruin my son's house. I said it out loud to the empty kitchen, and then I said the thing I'd say to her face soon. Enough. It's not his house. My phone. Screen lit up on the table, buzzing against the wood. I turned it over. The caller ID was my commander, Captain Doyle, on a Saturday night. I answered, and his voice was level and serious. Sergeant Thorne, we need to talk about what's coming to your door tomorrow. Captain Doyle did not waste words, which is one of the reasons I'd have followed him through a wall. He told me a caseworker from Child Protective Services would be coming to do an assessment because a report had been filed. And that's simply what happens. The report gets worked every time. No exceptions. He told me that because we're military, family advocacy was already looped in, and that he would be there himself in person representing the command, because that's how the process runs when one of his soldiers is involved. Then he told me the thing I needed to hear, and the thing I needed to be warned about in the same breath. Your record speaks for you, he said. Let it speak. Don't argue. Don't perform. Put the truth and the paperwork on the table and let people read it. He made it very clear that nothing about my rank was going to decide this. The conditions would be assessed on their face by the caseworker on the merits. Cleared or not cleared would come down to facts, not stripes. I told him I understood, and I did. I wasn't being handed a win. I was being told to get out of the truth's way and let it work. After we hung up, I sat in the dark a while longer. Somewhere across town, Linda was no doubt telling Brenda and Pat that she'd handled it, that she'd reported the unfit mother, that the authorities were finally going to see what she'd seen. She thought she was the one who'd called the system down. She had no idea the system was already standing behind me, and that tomorrow she was going to find out exactly which way it faced. Linda came by Sunday morning uninvited. The way she did everything, she dressed up. She wanted to smooth things over, which in her language meant she wanted me to agree that none of this would go any further for the good of the family name. She stood in my half-painted living room and told me a mother understands what's best. And then, for one strange minute, the armor slipped, and I saw the actual woman underneath. She talked about the years she raised Daniel alone, about nights walking the floor with a colicky baby while her husband was at some post she couldn't pronounce, about the particular loneliness of loving someone the army owns a piece of. Her voice cracked. That minute, I felt for her. I really did, because I knew that loneliness from the inside now. But then she wiped her eyes and her jaw set, and she put it all right back on me. I raised my son alone, so the army couldn't have him, she said. Now it has you, and it's taking my grandson too. That was the moment I stopped feeling sorry for her, because grief is real, but she decided to turn hers into a weapon and aim it at a 10-week-old's crib. Then she said something that told me just how upside down she had it. I already told the worker everything, she said, almost smug. They'll see. She thought she was the Complainant, she thought when the case worker came, she'd be the responsible grandmother handing over evidence against the bad mother. I didn't correct her. There are some lessons a person has to walk all the way into. I just said, I'm sure they'll see everything, and showed her the door. By Sunday afternoon, Pat's video had done its work. It had jumped from the neighborhood page to a couple of group chats, and a handful of people who'd never met me felt entitled to an opinion about what kind of mother I was. Two of them texted me directly. All concern, no questions. Brenda was loving it. She sent a string of messages that boiled down to one idea. Everyone's on our side. You should just apologize and make it quiet. The old me, the 18-year-old from the trailer, would have fired back, would have typed and deleted and typed again until 2 a.m. The soldier I'd become did something harder. Nothing. I did not post a single word in my own defense. I didn't argue with strangers about my son. Instead, I took everything I had, the timeline, Dana's photo, the binder, the clinic visit, and I sent it to the caseworker through the proper channel. And I asked Dana if she'd be willing to be there in person to say what she saw. She said yes before I finished asking. That's the whole difference. And it took me years to learn it. They fight with noise. I answer with records. I don't argue with rumors. I answer with paperwork. Let the loud people be loud. The quiet truth was sitting in a binder on my kitchen table with dates on every page, and it wasn't going anywhere. That night, I laid Noah down in the borrowed bassinet and folded the wheat-colored blanket, washed clean. Now, up over his chest, I sat beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe. And I let myself feel for the first time. All weekend, almost study. Tomorrow they were coming. I was ready for them to call me. Monday morning, I want to be honest about, because pretending I wasn't scared would be its own kind of lie. I knew the stakes. An assessment can clear you, but it can also open a longer investigation. And a longer investigation touches everything. Your custody, your career, your security clearance, your name on a base where everybody talks. If the facts had been murky, if my paperwork had been sloppy, I'd have been looking at months of proving I wasn't what a video said I was. So I did the only thing I know how to do under pressure. I prepared. I went through the binder one final time at the kitchen table, tab by tab, the way I'd check a weapon before I trusted my life to it. Dana came early in her good blouse, nervous and fierce and ready. The house still carried a ghost of primer, so I went room to room and opened every window I could reach, and the cold morning air pushed the last of that smell out the back of the house. Funny, the things you fixate on. I just couldn't stand the idea of them walking in and smelling what she'd done. I made coffee. Nobody drank. I held Noah and watched the street. At 10 on the dot, a plain sedan turned onto our block and slowed in front of the house. And behind it, a second car, government plates, the kind I knew on sight. My pulse went up, and my hands stayed flat and still the way I've trained them to. 3 hours after the report was filed on Saturday, the nurse had done her part. Now, 2 days later, the rest of it was pulling up to my curb. The doorbell rang. The caseworker introduced herself as Ms. Ruiz, and she was exactly what you'd want and exactly what you'd fear. Calm, neutral, unreadable. A woman whose whole job is to not take anybody's word for anything. She had a folder of her own. Before I could say a word, Linda swept in from where she'd been waiting on the porch because of course she'd come, and she launched into reversion like she'd been rehearsing it all weekend, which she had. Thank goodness you're here, she told Ruiz. I'm the only stable adult this baby has. She talked about the absent mother who ran off to play soldier. She talked about the state of the house, conveniently leaving out who'd made it that way. She gestured at the half-painted walls she had painted as evidence of my neglect. Brenda stood at her shoulder, nodding along and out. On the lawn, Pat had her phone up again, filming the grandmother's brave stand. I stood there holding Noah, and I said almost nothing, which nearly killed me. Every instinct screamed to defend myself, to match Linda word for word. But Doyle's voice was in my head. Don't perform, let it speak. So I let Linda talk. I let her build the whole story, brick by brick, the responsible grandmother and the runaway mother, right up to the top where she stood, proud as anything. Ruiz listened and wrote, and her face gave away nothing at all. Then Ruiz turned to me, pen ready, and asked me to walk her through my side. And for the first time since I'd driven onto that street and seen 4 white slats in the trash, I gotta open my mouth. I didn't raise my voice. I reached for the binder. I didn't tell Rue a story. I handed her one she could read herself. The family care plan, first with Dana's approved and vetted name on it, signed and dated, and Linda's name nowhere on any line. The new parent support enrollment with Calloway's scheduled visit right there on the calendar. The pediatrician same day clearance from Saturday showing a healthy baby. Dana's photo with its timestamp. My drill orders proving exactly where I was and that I had no legal way to leave. I didn't leave him with no one. I said level as I could make it. I left him with a plan. She threw the plan in the trash. Rue Page. She is not a woman who schemes. She compared the family care plan to what Linda had just told her, and I watched the temperature in the room change without anyone touching the thermostat. Linda's smile started to slip at the corners. Brenda went quiet. Donna spoke when Ruiz asked her to plain and steady and said she'd been dismissed from the home by Linda and Brenda over her objection that she tried to reach me and couldn't, that the last thing she saw was Linda dragging the crib toward the door. Ruiz wrote it all down. Then she lifted her eyes from the binder and looked not at me but at Linda. Mrs. Thorne, she said in that careful, neutral voice that's somehow scarier than shouting, you dismissed the approved caregiver and you turned away the home visit nurse. Is that correct? On the record, the silence in my living room had a texture to it. Linda opened her mouth. For once, nothing useful came out. Ruiz had already spoken to Calloway. That's how the job works. You don't take a report and forget it. You build it out. With Linda standing right there, Ruiz confirmed the nurse's account point by point, and every point landed on Linda like a brick coming off a roof. The crib and the trash bin observed at the curb, the smell of fresh primer. Through the open door, the infant placed to sleep on an adult bed in a closed, fume-filled room beside a running heater. a stranger at the door telling the nurse there was no soldier here today and to leave. Calloway's report and Dana's photo and my drill orders all told the same story with the same times, and Linda's version was the only one. That didn't fit. She tried to cut in. This is for real family, not some. And Ruiz lifted one hand, not unkindly, and Linda's sentence died in the air. I watched it dawn on her, slow and awful. The realization rearranging her whole face. She had not summoned the authorities to judge me. The authorities were here because of what she had done. She wasn't the complainant. She was the subject of the report. Brenda saw it too, and I watched Daniel's sister begin. The quiet arithmetic of a person deciding which side of a sinking boat to stand on. Out on the lawn, Pat had lowered her phone. Nobody was performing anymore. And just when I thought the room couldn't get any heavier, I heard a car door close out front, firm and precise. The sound of someone who's been trained to do everything, including shut a door with intention. I looked through my open front window. There was still one piece of this Linda hadn't accounted for, and it was walking up my front path in dress uniform. The car was a government sedan, the kind I knew on sight, and the man stepping out of it wore an army service uniform, pressed to a knife's edge with a family advocacy liaison a step behind him. To anyone who didn't know better, it looked like the cavalry arriving to investigate the unfit mother, and Linda did not know better. I watched her spine straighten and the hope come back into her eyes. And God help me, she actually smiled. She thought the army had come for me. See, she said to Rue, to Brenda, to anyone listening, and there was real triumph in it. See, even the army knows. Even they can see what she is, but lifted her phone back up, sensing a final. Brenda edged closer to her mother again, hope being contagious, and I stood in the middle of my own living room with my son asleep against my chest, and the Weedo LED blanket tucked around him, and I said nothing because I knew what they didn't. I knew the uniform. I knew the gate. I knew before he reached the steps exactly whose command I fell under and exactly why he'd come in person on a Monday morning. Linda kept talking, narrating her own victory, telling the officer through the screen door that she was the grandmother, that she was the one who'd been holding this family together. The liaison opened the door. The captain stepped inside, took the room in with one sweep, the binder open on the table, the caseworker, the nurse's account, the half-painted walls, the woman with primer still ground into her cuticles. And then he found me. He stopped. He came to attention in the middle of my living room, and every single person in that house was about to learn who I actually was all at once. The second that officer opened his mouth, he raised his hand in a salute, crisp as a flag in wind, and he said it loud, enough for the whole room and the open window and Pat's little phone to catch. Sergeant Thorne, Captain Doyle, my commander. I shifted Noah to my left arm and returned it because some things are reflex no matter what you're holding. And I said, sir, and that was all. You could have heard the house settle. Linda's face came apart in stages. First, confusion, like the words didn't make sense in that order. Then a kind of grasping, her eyes going from Doyle to me and back, looking for the joke, the mistake, the explanation that would put the world back the way she'd built it. And then she said it, the question that ended her version of the day in a voice. Gone thin and high and stripped of all. Its earlier triumph. Why? Why is he calling you sergeant? Nobody answered her right away. We didn't have to. The salute had already said it. The army. Brat she'd been sneering about for 2 years. The runaway mother who'd abandoned her baby to play soldier was. The soldier, an 11-year non-commissioned officer her own son had married, standing calm in her uniform in her own home with her child safe in her arms. Doyle lowered his hand and turned to Ruiz, all business like he hadn't just rearranged the molecules in the room. I'm here as Sergeant Thorne's commander, representing family advocacy. He said, I'll tell you up front, her record is one of the cleanest on the Estación. Linda made a small sound, the sound of a story she told 100 times collapsing all at once. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. This was the part I'd thought about all night, lying awake next to the bassinet. There was a version of that morning where I let it rip, where I stood in front of Ruiz and Doyle and Pat's camera and Brenda's stunned face, and I made Linda eat every cruel thing she'd ever said about me slow in public with witnesses. I'd earned that version. Nobody in that room would have blamed me for taking it, but I've learned that the loudest revenge is usually the cheapest, and it leaves you holding less than you started with. So I didn't reach for it. When Ruiz asked me what I wanted to see happen, I kept my voices flat, and even as I kept it all morning, I told her my son's safety came first and last. I told her I wanted Linda's name kept off every caregiver list, every plan, every document that touched Noah's life. I told her I wanted the truth in the file, in order with dates where no one could ever throw it in the trash. And then I told her the thing that surprised even me as it came out. I don't need her punished. I said, I need her name off my son's life. Doyle gave a small nod, the kind that means a thing has been understood and will be done. Ruiz wrote it down. Linda stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, because in her world, strength means the heel on the throat, and she could not process a woman who had won and chose not to grind. I wasn't being generous. I was being free. There is a difference. And standing there with Noah's heartbeat against mine, I finally knew which one I wanted. That was when Linda finally broke, and it was loud. All the pressure she'd been holding behind that pleasant, immovable face came out sideways, the way it always does with people like her when the script stops working. She turned on Doyle and demanded to know who he thought he was. She turned on Rue and called the whole thing a setup, a conspiracy, the army protecting its own. She turned on Dana and called her a liar. In a borrowed blouse, she invoked the family name like a spell that had stopped working, and she got louder with every sentence, the volume climbing as the ground gave way under her. And here is the thing I want you to see, because it's the whole secret of how you win. These without ever throwing a punch. She was screaming and I was quiet. The grandmother who'd lectured me for 2 years about dignity was coming apart at the seams in my living room, and the army brat she'd thrown out with the trash was standing perfectly still, holding her grandson, saying nothing at all. Brenda had stopped nodding. She'd stepped a full pace away from her mother and was studying her shoes, the unmistakable posture of someone preparing to claim they were never really part of it. Out on the lawn, Pat quietly slid her phone into her pocket, because the only footage worth having now was footage she very much did not want. The power in that room had changed hands completely, and not one decil of it had come from me. Then my phone buzzed against the kitchen table hard. Twice, I glanced down. It was a video call, the little icon spinning from a number routed halfway around the world. Daniel, and the first thing my husband said when his face filled the screen was, "Mom did what?" I turned the phone so Daniel could see the room, his mother red-faced and shouting, the caseworker, the captain, the half-painted walls, our son asleep. Through all of it, he'd gotten 10 minutes of connection between missions, and his first sergeant had told him enough to send him looking for a signal. For a second, the whole house went still. To listen, even Linda, because some part of her still believed her son would take her side. He did not, Mom, Daniel said, and his voice came through that little speaker, tired and final. You will not be alone with him again until you've done every class they tell you to do, and you're leaving Crystal's house today. Linda said his name like a question, like a plea. He didn't answer it. He looked at me through the screen and said, I've got you. Finish it. And the call dropped back into the dark. He'd come from the room, exhaled. Ruiz closed her folder and laid out where things stood plainly for everyone to hear. The approved caregiver had been dismissed. The unsafe sleep conditions had been created by Linda. The nurse's report, the photo, the orders, the clearance, all agreed. As for the concern in the original report, the concern about the mother, it was unsubstantiated. The file would reflect that the danger came from a different adult entirely. Linda started to speak, and I finally turned to face her, and I said the only thing I'd been saving up all weekend. Soft and certain. The way you sat down. Something heavy you've carried too far. You said no army brat would ever ruin your son's house. I let it sit there. A second with Noah breathing against my collarbone. This was never his house. Linda, it's our home, and now it's all on record. She had no answer. For the first time since I'd met her, Linda Thorne had absolutely nothing to say. The fallout was quiet and exact, which is the only kind I trust. Ruiz documented that the report against me was unsubstantiated, that my family care plan was valid and properly followed, and that the safety concern was attributable to Linda's conduct in the home. Linda was removed from every caregiver list and barred from unsupervised contact with Noah until she completed the full slate of family advocacy classes, which she would have to attend on her own time in a room full of strangers, learning the things she'd been so sure she already knew. No one was arrested. No one was hurt. I never raised a hand or my voice or even a lawyer. I just put the truth on a table and let the right people read it. That's the whole trick, and it's not really a trick at all. Pat's video did the rest of the work for me. Once the neighbors learned what had actually happened, who'd thrown a newborn's crib in the trash and who'd been at lawful drill, the comments turned, and Pat took the video down before noon and got very busy not making eye contact at church. Brenda sent me a long, careful message about how she'd never been comfortable with any of it, which we both knew was a lie, and I let her have it because peace is sometimes just letting people rewrite their own small parts. As Linda gathered her things to leave my house, she stopped in the doorway looking for one last piece of high ground. I didn't give it to her. You kept saying, family. I told her, calm as Sunday. Today the family that handles my son is the one with his name on the plan. She left without the smile she'd come with. I watched her car turn off her street, and then I went and got my mother's recipe. Magnet straight on the fridge because some small thing in me needed to put one thing back in order. When everyone had gone, the house was suddenly very quiet. The good kind of quiet, the kind I'd been chasing all weekend. I went out to the curb in the last of the afternoon light, and I pulled the crib out of the trash bin. Myself slapped by a white slat. Some of it was scuffed, and one rail was cracked. And I decided right then I'd order a new one in the morning, but I wasn't going to leave my son's bed sitting in the garbage 1 minute longer just to make a point. I carried it back up the walk and set it in the front room. Then I went through the whole house and opened every window again, even though it was cold, and let the wind take the last of the primer smell out the back door until the air in my home smelled like nothing but cold evening and clean laundry. The walls were still half gray. I'd paint them back myself, my color on my schedule. I fed Noah and I wrapped him in the wheat-colored blanket, washed soft again, the last thing my mother's hands ever made, and I told him about her in a low voice while he blinked up at me with his father's eyes. I told him she'd have liked him. I told him she made things that lasted, and sitting there in the quiet I'd fought so hard, for I finally understood the thing about myself I'd spent years being ashamed of. All that careful, all those lists and tabs and dated pages everyone teased me about. It was never fear. Careful was love written down in a form no one could ball up and throw away. My mother knit a blanket so I'd always have her hands around my son. I'd built a binder so the truth would always have somewhere to stand. Same instinct, different yarn. I held him until he slept, and for the first time in 3 days, I slept too. I want to be clear about the boundary I set, because boundaries are the whole point and people get them wrong in both directions. I did not cut Linda off forever and swear a blood oath, because that's just a different kind of drama. And Noah might someday want to know his grandmother as more than a cautionary guy, but I did not pretend it never happened either, because pretending is how people teach you it's okay to do it. Again, here's what I told her in a short message in writing where there could be no confusión later. If she wanted to see Noah, it would be supervised after she'd finished every class the program required, and never on I'll just pop by. Every caregiver in his life would go through the plan on paper, approved the way the rules I happen to live by already require. No more surprise visits, no more deciding that love means getting her own way in my house. The door isn't locked, I told her, and I meant it. But from now on, I'm the one holding the key. She didn't write back for a long time. When she finally did, it was 4 words, and they weren't an apology, but they were closer than I'd ever expected. I signed up Monday for the classes. I read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table with the binder closed. For once, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight. For 2 years. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not yet, but the first cold morning of A. Maybe, and maybe was more than she'd ever given me, the weeks after were calmer than I had any right to expect. Daniel came home on emergency leave A little sooner than planned, and the first thing he did was put the new crib together in the nursery by the window in the good morning light while I held the screwdriver and pretended to supervise. He had a longer conversation with his mother than I was part of, and I didn't ask for the details. Some repairs are between a son and the woman who raised him alone, and I'd learned the hard way. You can't do that work for anybody else. Linda did start the classes, and from what I heard, she didn't enjoy being a student again at 62, sitting in a circle with young parents learning the very basics of keeping a baby safe. Good. Some lessons are supposed to be uncomfortable. Brenda kept her distance, which suited me fine. The apology she'd sent turned out to be the high water mark of our relationship, and I made my peace with that. Pat found a new project to disapprove of somewhere I wasn't, and me, I kept the binder. Of course I did. Only now there was a new tab in it near the front with a case number and a single closed report that said in the flat language of people who deal in facts that the mother had done nothing wrong. I'll keep that page forever. Not because I need it anymore, because there were 2 years of my life where I'd have given anything to be believed. And now I'm holding the proof, dated and signed, in a form no one can ever throw in the trash. Noah sleeps in his new crib under his grandmother's blanket. He sleeps fine. They were so sure that being a soldier made me less of a mother. It turned out it made me exactly the kind who keeps the receipts, holds the line, and keeps a child safe while everyone else is busy with the show. That's my story. One trash bin, one nurse who knocked at exactly the right hour, and a single word, Sergeant, my mother-in-law never saw coming. If this reminded you that quiet preparation is its own kind of courage, then update your own plan today, whatever your version of it is. And if there's someone in your life who's the careful one everybody underestimates, send this to them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.